Have you ever been backed into a corner in front of millions of people because of what you believe? Imagine being on the most watched TV show in the country and hearing, "Your faith is just an act, isn't it?" What would you say if someone tried to publicly destroy everything that gives your life meaning? Today you'll discover how the innocent question of a child can silence the most powerful man on television, and how the truth holds a power that no amount of money or fame can buy. But what really happened in that studio when the cameras were rolling? And why would a letter from a 9-year-old girl change everything forever? Get ready for a story that will make you question, how far would you go to defend what you truly believe in? Jonathan's apartment remained immersed in the silence of the morning when the phone cut through the quiet like a blade. The bare walls, decorated only with a wooden crucifix hand-carved by his Lebanese grandmother, reflected the voluntary simplicity of his life. On the kitchen table, piles of fan letters from The Chosen, mixed with unpaid bills and a Bible worn from constant use. He answered on the third ring, still wearing the same t-shirt he had worn for the past 2 days, his dark eyes carrying the weight of someone who knew the struggle of finances intimately. The voice on the other end of the line sounded professional and enthusiastic, talking about a special opportunity on the most watched show on nighttime television. "Mr. Roumie, we'd like to invite you to a celebration of religious diversity in media," said the producer, her voice echoing through the old handset. "And why me?" asked Jonathan, genuinely curious about the true intentions behind the invitation. The producer explained that the show wanted to highlight how different expressions of faith found a place in modern popular culture, specifically mentioning the global success of The Chosen. Jonathan listened as he stared at the faded photograph of his father on the shelf. A man who had died believing his son would never be anything more than a failed dreamer. His nervous fingers drummed on the scratched wooden table, remembering the days he worked as a production assistant on major film sets, hauling equipment and secretly dreaming of one day being on the other side of the camera. The irony was not lost on him. Now that he had finally gained recognition for portraying the most important figure in human history, he felt more humbled than ever. The apartment around him told the story of someone who had deliberately chosen to live with less in order to give more. "We need authentic voices that can speak about faith inclusively," continued the producer, her words carefully chosen. "Authenticity is non-negotiable," replied Jonathan, sensing there was more behind the invitation than appeared. 3 days later, Jonathan walked through the busy streets toward the studios, his footsteps echoing on the cold concrete sidewalk. The contrast between his world and the one he was about to enter could not have been more stark. He wore the same navy blue blazer that had belonged to his father, slightly too large on his shoulders, while around him rose glass and steel skyscrapers that symbolized the power of corporate media. His mind involuntarily wandered back to that terrible day in May of 2018, when he had woken up with a negative bank balance and only 20 crumpled dollars in his wallet. That morning 6 years ago, he had knelt before the same crucifix that he now observed from afar through the window of his apartment, finally surrendering his career and dreams into God's hands. The miracle of the 4 checks that arrived in the mail that very day still moved him to tears. "Lord, if you want me to be there, let your will be done," he whispered softly, his prayer lost in the noise of traffic. "Let me be only an instrument of your peace," he added, discreetly touching the rosary in the inner pocket of his jacket. The network's studios rose before him like a cathedral of modern entertainment, their glass facades reflecting the overcast afternoon sky. Jonathan paused for a moment at the main entrance, watching the constant movement of well-dressed executives, assistants rushing with clipboards, and technical equipment being transported through hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. The main lobby boasted imported marble, crystal chandeliers, and gigantic photographs of celebrities who had passed through those halls over the decades. He remembered working behind the scenes on major productions, always observing from a distance, never imagining that one day he would be the special guest. His calloused hands, marked by years of manual labor before fame, contrasted with the polished environment around him. "Welcome to our studios, Mr. Roumie," said a young production assistant, approaching with a professional smile. "It's an honor to be here," replied Jonathan, immediately noticing the youth and nervousness of the young man. The assistant led him through maze-like hallways, past makeup rooms where other personalities prepared for their appearances, smaller studios where morning shows were being recorded simultaneously, and a luxurious cafeteria where the aroma of gourmet coffee mixed with conversations about ratings and sponsors. Jonathan absorbed every detail of that world, which represented everything Jesus had stood against when he drove the merchants out of the temple. The contrast between the opulence around him and the simplicity of the teachings he tried to embody in his performance made him uncomfortable, but not surprised. He knew well the temptation of money and fame, having consciously chosen to reject them in favor of something more lasting. With each step, he felt more convinced that God had placed him there for a specific purpose. The show will begin in 2 hours, but first we need a quick conversation about the format, explained the assistant, stopping in front of a door marked Meeting Room 3. What kind of format? Jonathan asked, already suspecting the answer. Inside the meeting room, 3 executive producers waited around a polished mahogany table, their laptops open displaying audience graphs and demographic data. The lead producer, a middle-aged woman in expensive clothes and a calculated smile, gestured as she explained how the show worked and what role they expected Jonathan to play. They wanted him to speak about spirituality in an accessible and non-sectarian way, avoiding specific mentions of Christ's exclusivity or doctrines that might alienate audiences from other religious traditions. The suggested script was full of empty phrases about universal love and diverse spiritual paths, turning his faith into something palatable for mass consumption. Jonathan listened politely, but his stomach churned at the attempt to water down the message to which he had dedicated his life. We prefer to keep the discussion more philosophical and less dogmatic, explained the producer, her eyes not meeting his directly. The truth doesn't become less true because it's inconvenient, Jonathan responded softly, but with unwavering firmness. The tension in the room became palpable when Jonathan politely but firmly declined to follow the suggested script. He explained that his faith was not something that could be edited or softened to fit audience expectations, reminding them of his previous work with Dallas Jenkins in The Two Thieves, where authenticity always prevailed over commercial convenience. The producers exchanged worried looks, clearly not expecting resistance from someone they assumed was desperate for media exposure. Jonathan remained calm, his hands resting quietly on the table, while inwardly praying for wisdom to navigate those turbulent waters without compromising his integrity. The room, its walls covered in awards and certificates, seemed to suffocate under the weight of unmet expectations. Mr. Roumie, we need you to understand that our audience is very diverse, insisted another producer, his voice filled with thinly veiled frustration. And I need you to understand that my faith is not a product that can be customized for different markets, Jonathan replied with unshakable kindness. 2 hours later, Jonathan sat in the guest chair, the studio lights creating an almost surreal atmosphere around him. The host, with his signature smile and impeccably tailored suit, discreetly flipped through his notes as the final countdown approached. The audience, composed of around 200 carefully selected people, eagerly awaited the start of the show, unaware that they were about to witness something very different from a typical promotional interview. Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the rosary in his pocket and remembering the words his father had once told him about never dishonoring the family name. The cameras assumed their final positions, while technicians made the last sound and lighting adjustments. "Well, here we go," said the host, with his trademark TV charisma. But Jonathan detected something sharper behind the smile. "May God give us the wisdom to speak the truth with love," murmured Jonathan, more to himself than to anyone present. The show began with the usual introduction and jokes about current events, but Jonathan could feel the subtle shift in atmosphere when it came time for him to be introduced. The host greeted him with apparent cordiality, praising his work in The Chosen and commenting on the series' global impact. But there was a predatory quality in his eyes that Jonathan recognized immediately. The first questions seemed harmless, exploring his background as an actor and the casting process for portraying Jesus. But they gradually began to take a more provocative turn. The audience laughed at the host's well-timed jokes, unaware of the growing tension between the two men on stage. Jonathan responded with honesty and grace, but remained alert for the moment when the mask of cordiality would finally fall. It must be interesting to portray such a controversial figure these days, the host commented, his first poisoned dart disguised as a casual remark. Jesus was never controversial to those who truly know him, Jonathan replied, immediately setting the tone for the confrontation to come. The host's smile widened predatorily as he leaned slightly forward in his chair, like a feline about to pounce on its prey. The studio lights seemed more intense now, casting dramatic shadows that accentuated the angular contours of his face, while his eyes sparkled with the anticipation of someone who had carefully prepared each question for maximum impact. The audience remained in expectant silence, unaware that they were about to witness not just an interview, but a true intellectual and spiritual duel between two completely opposite worldviews. Jonathan maintained his calm posture, but his fingers unconsciously touched the rosary in his pocket, a tangible anchor amid the approaching storm. The air in the studio felt electrically charged, like the tense moments before a great storm. "You know, Jonathan, I need to be honest with you," said the host, his voice taking on a more serious and direct tone. "Sometimes I wonder if you actors who play religious figures don't just become professional performers of faith, selling a spirituality you know the audience wants to buy." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb about to explode, and Jonathan felt the weight of millions of viewers waiting for his response. He took a deep breath, recalling the early mornings when he woke up at 5 a.m. to pray the Divine Mercy Rosary, even before brushing his teeth, a practice he had kept religiously for more than 6 years, long before any camera was pointed at him. His hands remained firmly on the arms of the chair as he processed not just the words, but the malicious intent behind them. The audience seemed to hold their breath, feeling the growing tension between the two men on stage. Jonathan knew that his next answer would define not only the tone of the rest of the interview, but potentially the testimony of his faith for millions of people. "I understand your concern, and it is valid," Jonathan replied with a calmness that surprised even himself. "But let me tell you about my morning routine. I wake up at 5 every day to pray the Divine Mercy Rosary, long before any camera is on or anyone is watching." The host clearly did not expect this direct and personal answer, but quickly regained his composure, adjusting his expensive tie while reworking his attack strategy. He had done his research on Jonathan, but apparently had not delved deeply enough into the intimate details of his spiritual life. The audience began murmuring softly, some visibly impressed by the raw sincerity in Jonathan's voice, while others appeared skeptical of what they might interpret as a well-executed public relations move. The cameras captured every micro-expression of the two men, every subtle change in body language that revealed the true nature of the ongoing confrontation. Jonathan continued, his voice gaining strength and passion as he ventured into more personal territory. "During the pandemic, when the whole world was isolated and desperate for hope, I started streaming those prayers live on my personal page," Jonathan went on, his eyes shining with genuine conviction. "There was no script, no production, just a man kneeling in his simple apartment, praying with strangers through a computer screen, because we all needed something real in a world that seemed to be falling apart." The host felt the control of the narrative slipping from his hands for the first time that night, but his decades of experience in television had taught him never to show weakness publicly. He straightened in his chair, adopting a more aggressive posture as he prepared his next attack, this time targeting what he considered the Achilles heel of anyone of faith, the question of religious exclusivity. His eyebrows furrowed in an expression of apparent intellectual confusion, a carefully constructed mask to disguise the calculated nature of his next move. The now more engaged audience leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something significant was unfolding before their eyes. Jonathan noticed the change in atmosphere and mentally prepared for what was to come, drawing on years of fasting and prayer that had taught him to maintain inner peace even amid the fiercest attacks. "Well, since you brought up your Catholic faith, I have to ask something that has always bothered me," said the host, his voice taking on a more personal and apparently vulnerable tone. "Do you really believe that only Christians go to heaven? That billions of good people, but of other religious traditions, are condemned simply for being born into the wrong family or the wrong country?" The question echoed through the studio like a gunshot, and Jonathan could feel the emotional weight behind it. realizing the host was revealing something deeply personal about his own spiritual journey. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the almost imperceptible hum of technical equipment and the occasional sound of someone in the audience shifting nervously. Jonathan immediately recognized that this was not just a journalistic question or an attempt to create controversy to boost ratings. It was the expression of a deep spiritual wound, possibly the reason why a man raised in the Catholic faith had turned away from it. He knew his answer needed to be not only theologically correct, but pastorally sensitive, touching the hurt heart behind the hostile question. "I can hear the pain in your question," Jonathan answered softly, leaning slightly forward with genuine compassion. "And I suspect it comes from a very personal place, perhaps from your own journey with the Catholic faith you were raised in." The host hesitated for a moment, clearly not expecting his emotional vulnerability to be recognized and treated with such kindness, but then decided to dive fully into the personal issue he had avoided addressing publicly for years. His hands clenched into fists on the table before him as he struggled internally between the professional need to maintain composure and the human desire to finally verbalize the doubts and grievances he had carried for decades. The audience remained in absolute silence, feeling they were witnessing something much more intimate and meaningful than any typical late-night talk show interview. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of this extraordinary encounter between two souls in very different spiritual territories. "You're right, it's personal," admitted the host, his professional mask finally slipping to reveal the wounded man underneath. "I walked away from Catholicism years ago because I couldn't handle the arrogance, the exclusivity, the idea that my Jewish grandmother, who was one of the kindest people I've ever known, would be condemned simply for not accepting Jesus Christ as her personal savior." Jonathan felt his heart break from the raw pain in the host's voice, recognizing in it the echo of his own spiritual struggles when he transitioned from the Greek Orthodox Church to Catholicism. A journey that taught him that authentic faith often requires navigating turbulent waters of doubt and questioning. He remembered his own Lebanese grandmother, who had carved the crucifix that now decorated his apartment, and how she had faced religious discrimination in her own life, teaching him that true faith must always be accompanied by humility and compassion. The atmosphere in the studio had completely changed. What began as an intellectual confrontation had turned into something much deeper and more human. Jonathan knew this moment demanded not only theological wisdom, but the same pastoral tenderness Jesus showed with the Samaritan woman at the well. "Your grandmother sounds like an extraordinary woman," Jonathan said with genuine sincerity, his words laden with respect and understanding. "And I can perfectly understand why questions about her eternal destiny would trouble you so much, especially coming from a tradition that should offer hope, not anxiety." But the host was not ready to accept compassion. His spiritual wound had been touched, and now he wanted to inflict the same pain, preparing his most personal and devastating attack against Jonathan. His eyes hardened again as he composed himself, channeling his personal pain into a sharp rhetorical weapon, determined to expose what he perceived as fundamental hypocrisy in the life of anyone who professed Christian faith while living in the modern world. The audience felt the shift in energy, the return of hostility, but now with an emotional intensity that had not existed before. Jonathan remained calm but alert, knowing the next attack would likely be the fiercest of all, meant not only to question his theology, but to destroy his personal credibility before millions of viewers. "Since we're being honest about personal issues, let me ask a question about your own life choices," said the host, his voice now loaded with sarcasm and accusation. "Don't you think it's at least a little hypocritical to be making millions of dollars playing a man who said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven? How do you reconcile your personal wealth with the teachings of the man you claim to follow?" Jonathan felt as if he had been struck by lightning, not by the accusation itself, but by the complete ignorance it revealed about his real life and personal choices. For a moment he considered the bitter irony of the situation. Here he was, a man who had deliberately chosen voluntary poverty, being accused of materialistic greed by someone who probably earned in a month more than he saw in an entire year. The audience waited in tense silence, many clearly expecting to see Jonathan defend himself with elaborate explanations or complex theological justifications. Instead, Jonathan did something no one expected. He smiled gently and reached into his back pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet that had seen better days. "That is an excellent question, and one I wish more Christians would ask themselves," Jonathan replied calmly, opening his wallet to reveal its simplicity. "Let me show you exactly how much wealth I have accumulated portraying Jesus Christ." Jonathan slowly opened his worn wallet, revealing a few crumpled dollars and a simple bank card, nothing remotely resembling the wealth that had been suggested. The silence in the studio became deafening as the cameras focused on the modest contents of his wallet, and the audience began to murmur in surprise and discomfort, realizing they had witnessed a completely unfounded accusation. The host remained frozen in his chair, his expression quickly shifting from anticipated triumph to total confusion, as if the carefully prepared script had been torn before his eyes. Jonathan gently closed the wallet and put it back in his pocket. But instead of exploiting his rhetorical advantage, he did something unexpected. He pulled a yellowed envelope from his blazer. The paper was clearly worn from frequent handling, and its edges were slightly torn, suggesting it had been read and reread countless times. "But allow me to share something much more important than my financial situation," said Jonathan, his voice taking on a softer, more personal tone. "This letter arrived 3 months ago from a little girl named Sarah, 9 years old, who is battling a rare type of blood cancer." The atmosphere in the studio changed instantly, shifting from hostility to something much deeper and solemn, as if the very air had become denser with the weight of the human reality being introduced into the conversation. The host felt a pang of discomfort growing in his stomach, sensing he was about to be confronted with something he could neither attack nor ridicule without revealing himself as a complete monster before his audience. Jonathan held the letter with a tenderness that spoke of someone who truly cared about every word written in it, and his hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it with reverent care. The audience leaned forward collectively, feeling they were about to hear something that would completely change the tone and direction of the entire conversation. The studio lights seemed less harsh now, creating a more intimate and respectful atmosphere. "Sarah wrote to me after watching some interviews on television where hosts made jokes about Jesus," Jonathan continued, his voice laden with genuine emotion. "She asked me if the funny man on television who makes jokes about Jesus really knows Jesus, or if he's just pretending he doesn't need him because he's afraid to admit he's lost." The host felt as if he had been struck by lightning, his hands trembling imperceptibly over the table as he processed the implications of the words of a child who had seen through his facade with brutal clarity. The audience remained in absolute silence, many visibly moved by the purity of Sarah's question. Jonathan continued holding the letter as if it were a precious treasure. "Sarah also wrote that she prays for you every night, asking Jesus to help the funny man on television find the peace she found, even facing something as frightening as her illness," Jonathan said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. "She said she hopes to meet you in heaven someday so you can be friends and he can see how kind and loving Jesus really is." The host felt tears form in his eyes, speechless for the first time in decades. A dying child was praying for his soul while he mocked the source of her hope. The audience watched respectfully as he wrestled with emotions he hadn't faced in years. Jonathan carefully folded the letter, waiting patiently. I don't know what to say to that," the host finally admitted, his voice hoarse and very different from the confident tone he had maintained throughout the interview. "How do you respond to a child who is facing that?" Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes shining with genuine compassion from someone who had learned to see Christ in the faces of the suffering. He thought of his portrayal of Jesus in the project about Saint Faustina Kowalska, an experience that taught him about divine mercy amid suffering. The studio remained in reverent silence as he chose his words carefully. "I told Sarah exactly what I am telling you now. Jesus is not an abstract idea or a philosophical concept we can debate intellectually," Jonathan answered with infinite tenderness. "He is a real person who knows every tear you have shed, every night you stayed awake wondering if there is something beyond this life, every moment you desperately wish that someone greater than you could fix everything broken in your heart." The host closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, They were shining with tears as he wrestled with decades of carefully constructed pain. He thought of his grandmother, of all the jokes he had made at the expense of people of faith. The audience watched respectfully as he publicly faced questions he had kept hidden for years. "You know, I told Sarah about my own journey with doubt," Jonathan continued softly. "How I grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church, then became Catholic. How I worked with Dallas Jenkins on a small film called The Two Thieves that eventually became the pilot for The Chosen, and how throughout that journey I often questioned whether God really cared about me, especially when my father died, thinking I would never be anything more than a failed dreamer." The vulnerability in Jonathan's voice hit the host like a wave. He finally understood that the man before him was offering something he hadn't found in years: genuine authenticity amid shared pain. The host felt the defenses he had built over decades crumble under the force of true compassion. The audience remained silent, moved by the transformation in real time. "I lost my faith after the scandals in the church," the host admitted, his voice breaking with emotion, repressed for years. "How can I believe in something that was so corrupted by people who supposedly represented God? How can I trust an institution that so spectacularly failed to protect the innocent?" Jonathan nodded with deep understanding, recognizing the wound that had festered in the host's heart for years. He recalled moments in his own life when he had questioned whether it was possible to find God amid human hypocrisy. The studio seemed enveloped in sacred intimacy, as if only two souls were conversing about the deepest questions of existence. "Jesus is not the institutional church," Jonathan said with calm but powerful conviction. "Jesus is Jesus. He was betrayed by one of his own disciples, abandoned by the others when he needed them most, and died among criminals. He intimately knows what it's like to be hurt by the very people who were supposed to protect him. The difference is that he turned that betrayal into redemption, that abandonment into salvation." The host looked at Jonathan and then did something that shocked everyone. He began to cry openly, years of repressed pain and spiritual longing finally finding expression. The audience remained respectful, understanding they were witnessing something sacred. Jonathan stood up and knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, offering silent presence amid deep brokenness. "May I pray for you?" Jonathan asked softly, his voice barely audible above the sound of the host's heavy breathing. "It doesn't have to be anything public or performative, just two people talking to God together." The host nodded through his tears, unable to speak, but clearly desperate for any form of peace that could be offered. Jonathan closed his eyes and began to pray softly, his words simple yet profound, asking God to heal the host's wounded heart and to help him find the way back to the faith he had lost. The audience remained in complete silence throughout the prayer, many of them also closing their eyes and quietly joining in the plea. When Jonathan finished, the host briefly embraced him, whispering a thank you that carried the weight of years of pain, finally being acknowledged and offered to divine care. The cameras captured everything, but somehow it didn't feel intrusive. Instead, it felt like a testament that grace can break through any barrier, even the bright lights and artificial atmosphere of national television. "Thank you for reminding me who I used to be," said the host when he finally found his voice again, "and for showing me who I still can become." If Jonathan Roumie's story and his courage to defend his faith touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment where you are watching from. And tell me, have you ever had to choose between pleasing people or being faithful to what you believe? May God bless your journey.